Hello there, I'm Bradford Sherman filling in for Duane Rigsby today, and on Ag Talk we're visiting with John Grimes, OSU Extension Beef Coordinator, and today's topic is going to be the focus on mid-year economic outlook for the beef industry. John, how are things shaping up for the beef industry so far as we're kind of here in the middle of the year?
Well, Brad, it's been a real interesting year for the beef industry, and it probably, I won't say it mirrors U.S. politics, but politics enters into what happens on the farm. Unfortunately, not everything is in a farmer's control on the farm, so we deal with that. But today we're going to highlight some of the different factors that are going to impact the future prices for beef producers. So as we move along, we'll start off with a picture of a Hereford cow, and this is kind of the backbone of the beef industry. The cow that is the factory, so to speak. That's the item that generates the calves that the producers will wind up selling. And this is a nice young Hereford cow that, again, you'll see different shapes and sizes and colors around, but
we'll see lots of those around here.
Certainly a good model type cow, the way she's built, and nice udder, and hopefully producers have this kind of cow as their foundation in their herds. But as we move along, like I said, today we're going to talk about economics, and our next slide shows industry profitability. And I know some of this might be a little hard to read, but just to highlight the different colors, the green portion of the bars represents the cow-calf industry. The blue part represents stockers, or the people that grow feeder calves, graze feeder calves, things like that. Red is the feedlot, and yellow is the packer. And you can kind of see over, basically this chart represents about 30 years over time, and unfortunately not every aspect is profitable. I think you can see some variation as we go over time, and again, probably the aspect that has the most consistent profitability as a segment of the industry is the cow-calf portion. You see that green bar north of that dividing line, so to speak, zero. And you can look back over this decade, especially which is in our recent memory. You can look at 2014 will probably go down as a record year in terms of profitability. You see
what happened during that time?
Well, that's where numbers got as low, and we'll have charts that show this later. That's where cow numbers got as low. So we're talking, a lot of this today is basic supply and demand. We have fewer numbers. In fact, I think we had fewer numbers then, and we'll expand on that in a few minutes. So supply was down, demand was still good, and therefore prices went up. Our next slide shows another factor that's really important to this whole thing, and this is probably what triggered some of the number change earlier in the decade. If you go Google U.S. Drought Monitor, you'll get to this page. I think it's out of the University of Nebraska, where it shows drought conditions based on color code, and obviously the real deep dark red is severe drought, and then red, and it lessens up the lighter the colors go, yellow kind of being the first stage of drought. And if you notice, Ohio just has a little bit of yellow up in northwest Ohio, but basically most of the corn belt where grain is produced, you think about Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, that looks pretty good. I mean, as far as no significant weather challenges. Now, you start just west of the Mississippi, and you look at Missouri. Missouri's really in a tough way. Most of the state is in some degree of drought, and that's a real important cattle state as well. So I think if I count them up right, there's roughly 11 states that are in some degree of drought, and when you say 11, southern part of Iowa, southeastern part of Iowa is included in that. But those states that have the colors, especially when you look at states like Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, there's quite a few cows in those states. So this isn't as severe as 2011. 2011, most of Texas and Oklahoma were the two darker shades of red. And so in those years, there were a lot of cows that either got relocated to different parts of the country or were sold into the food chain. So Mother Nature and weather has a large impact on this, and we'll talk about more about inventory. In fact, that's what we'll do now. We'll move to the next slide where we talk about numbers, and this is data that comes from the National Ag Statistics Service from USDA, and it compares 2017, 2018 mid-year numbers. And if you notice on the far right-hand side, most of these categories, these different genders, sexes, weight sizes, show increases in numbers, except for one that's fairly significant, and that's beef replacement heifers. What that says is producers are keeping fewer heifers back as replacements to replace cows, and we'll see a chart here in a second that shows this a little more visually, but we have been in expansion mode for the last 3 to 5 years. It bottomed out in 2014, and so economic signals, when you saw that chart that showed the large profitability in 2014 and 15, that gave farmers the signal to increase numbers. So that's what they did, and we're seeing it kind of come to a plateau, and I think our next slide visually shows this. If you look at that, how it bottomed out kind of in 2014, yes. I think as of January 1 that year, the national herd was around 29 million beef cows, and that was the lowest it had been in over 50 years. And then you see that steady increase up to this year, and it's got projections for what they expect to happen in 2019 and 20. So, yeah, it's 250,000 cows is a lot of cows, what they expect to increase in fiscal 2019, but compared to the last 3 or 4 years, it's pretty small. So we've basically, since 2014, increased the herd by, this time next year, we'll have increased to 3 million cows. And that's through either not selling mature cows or keeping more replacement heifers. So that earlier slide showed a decrease in the number of heifers was kind of a sign that maybe we're ready to start plateauing on cow numbers. So it's interesting how it works out as far as weather, impact of economics and sales. So we'll see how it goes. But I think as far as just statistics, I wanted to start with that and give you an idea why things are going the way they are. So, okay. Our next slide.
Well, tell us what are some of the factors that impact how much beef is purchased by the consumer?
Well, supply and demand, the consumer may or may not want to purchase it, but if it's not available, prices will go up. If there's a plentiful supply of it, prices tend to moderate. I mean, that's just common sense would tell you that, but there are other factors because we do have competition for the consumer's dollars. We have pork and poultry that are competing proteins, and this chart that we just brought up, this one shows per capita red meat and poultry consumption in this country, and you can kind of see it followed. Beef was part of it, but this also includes pork and poultry. But you see how it kind of declined there earlier in the decade, got down. Well, that's when prices were higher. We had higher retail prices for protein, and all of the protein sources have been in expansion mode. Well, the consumers have been buying it as prices tend to come down. Not just prices, but also what do they have to spend, and that's our next slide. It shows their income. You see how this kind of mirrors how consumption's going, which stands to reason. The economy is improving, and they're projecting that they're going to have more income to spend. They'll tend to buy maybe maybe they'll buy steak instead of hamburger, something like that. So maybe these two sides, this slide and the one previous, complement each other as far as income to spend. Maybe they're buying cars or they're going on trips and things like that. So it does impact the farm. Their buying habits do impact farmers, and it's it is pretty interesting. So how does this relate to price? Our next slide does reflect that, and this is just over the last 3 years, but you see some of the peaks and valleys, and really the lines somewhat mirror each other. The 2017 maybe shifted a little more to the right, but basically what's happening so far in 2018 and projected, the black line compared to 2016, those are pretty close. I mean, they kind of behave as far as up and down part of the cycle, but you do see that compared to 2016, and if we had 2014 and 15, that bar would even have been higher as far as the price, but see how the price is moderated over the last 2 years? They're forecasting that the average retail price for beef in 2018 will average about $5.65. I'm not sure what the average was for 16 and 17, but you can see that 18 for the whole year is projected to be cheaper than the previous 2 years. And again, I think that's a reflection of supply. And consumers have got more money to spend, so they have choices. They can buy pork or poultry. So I think that all kind of rolls together. But this is some domestic data, but as we've talked earlier, Brad, that it's a world market. And I think our next slide, we're going to start getting into a different area.
Yeah, we hear so much talk today in the media about trade. You can't turn on the news and not hear something about trade wars and trade, everything going on. Mm-hmm. How is all this affecting the beef industry today?
Well, it's affecting the beef industry as well as agriculture as a whole. Not just beef, but the pork and poultry and grain. Mm-hmm. It's a volatile issue, so to speak. And our next slide kind of will start talking about that. Exports are huge to agriculture, and this just kind of gives you a historic timeline. And you look at 1990, where we were at, and then how it has steadily climbed over the last almost 30 years. And all the species have increased volume. But if you look, it's a little harder to read, but if you look at 2004, you see the blue line, which represents beef, how that dropped. Yeah. Well, in case you forgot what that might be, that was when we had that one case of mad cow disease in Washington State.
Okay.
And what happened there is a lot of our trading partners shut off beef because of that one cow. Mm-hmm. And that was a huge loss to the industry. And if you look where we were at in 2003, and then look where it dropped to in 2004, 5, and 6, and look how long it took to build that back up.
Oh, absolutely.
So that was it's not environmental, it's an animal effect that happened, but the trade policies of our partners impacted what they would buy. So you don't see quite the dramatic shift in pork or poultry. Is that poultry has experienced pretty phenomenal growth, as has pork, but you don't see that intense drop like you saw in beef in 2003. So that was one big factor, but you see beef since that event has steadily climbed as well. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a interesting tidbit there. Our next slide talks about imports and exports, and there's this really gets into politics, Brad, where you talk about trade policies, protectionism, world markets, things like that. But if you look how that bar changes over time, if you just kind of look at 2010 and where it's projected to go out next year, if you monitor, including 2019, if you monitor back 10 years, it's almost, I think it's equal. 5 years we're a net exporter, and 5 years we're a net importer. And if you look at the most recent spike difference, it was around 2014.
Yeah, the mag
when we, well, 2014 where we got the drought.
2014, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
2004.
Well, you saw, okay, let's see, BSE.
Yeah.
That's the acronym for Mad Cow. So you saw that huge spike downward.
Right.
That's a great point. I'm glad you caught that. Look at the difference between the blue line and the red line. Well, the next time we saw a spike, nothing like 2004, is 2014. That's when we were low on numbers, our prices got high, so we imported more than likely cheaper beef, which is typically for grinding, for hamburger, things like that. But since we started building numbers, then look how that blue line's going. It's going upward. And so it's cyclical. That's the main thing I want to say. Up until about 2010, though, we were a net importer. Okay, the red line was always above the blue line, but then you look now and you see how it chops back and forth. Again, we've become more of a world market, I think, and so exports have become very much more important to us. And if you want to get into a lively coffee shop discussion, some people, we're talking about beef today, but you could probably have this discussion about cars, electronics, clothing. There's lots of things that we can have this discussion on. So I don't want to get into politics today, but when you hear them talk about tariffs and trade wars, this is important. I mean, this is actual dollars and cents going back to the farms and ranches in this country. So I think it's, I'm not an economics major, but I do understand basic supply and demand, and I think we're spoiled. We go to the grocery store and we can buy strawberries 12 months a year, 365 days a year. We like to have the access to the food that we want. And I think the world is becoming that way too. I think as economies grow and prosper, and obviously a popular country to talk about is China, just because of its sheer volume and size of population. But there's lots of opportunities there, and I guess the best thing I can say is I hope they get it worked out as far as trade policies. And we have other important partners too. I think our next slide shows this, who are our partners in beef exports. And this is a 5-year average, and in 2018 it'll look slightly different than this, but in general these are the 5 primary players, and we look in a pretty heavy influence of Southeast Asia than our neighbors. Japan has always been, not always, but except for the year the mad cow thing happened, that they've been a strong partner, and they buy quite a lot of our beef. You've probably heard of the term Wagyu beef or Kobe beef. That's the real high quality, high marble beef. Japan likes as much quality as they get, so they tend to buy some of our high grading choice and prime type beef to complement what they can raise. Japan's a big partner. South Korea has been really strong, especially this year. They've been exceptionally strong. Of course, our neighbors, Canada and Mexico and Hong Kong's also important. Now, there's some that believe that obviously Hong Kong's an important partner, and a lot of that probably is working its way into mainland China. But these are here. Now this year, if you saw the 2018 figures, Taiwan is a major player as well. So these are people, so when you hear discussions on the news about battling with China or NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA definitely impacts Mexico and Canada, whereas we were formerly in what they called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is obviously Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam historically has been a good importer. They would be in that others category. So I think it's interesting to know who our partners are, and so when you hear the news, you hear discussion about who we're fighting with or who we're agreeing with, those are countries that you probably should pay some attention to. So I think that's enough on exports and trade in that part. Now we're going to talk about quality, and I've talked to Duane about this before. I know some of these fonts might be a little hard to read, but the colors represent different quality grades of beef. Now, if you go to the store, when they talk about quality grade, they're evaluating the marbling or flecks of fat inside of the ribeye muscle, and that's how they grade it. And the 3 grades that that you most commonly see would be prime, which is the purple line, which is on the bottom there. It's a pretty exclusive grade. Not a large percentage of our beef grades prime. It kind of floats from year to year, somewhere between 5 and 10% is graded prime, and that has increased over time. Choice is the most common grade that we see today, and these are in pounds, a million pounds. The left-hand axis that shows it there, and then select is yellow, and that is the leaner or less marbled beef of the three. What's happened over the last, if you carried this back even to 2000, we've seen a steady increase in choice and prime and a lessening of select, especially over the last 5 years. You see that yellow line crossing down. And when they say premium choice, there are three grades of choice: low, medium, and high. And premium choice would be medium or high, and that would represent a brand such as Certified Angus Beef that's got a little higher quality grade than just the average choice. So you see an increase in the red bar and a decrease in the yellow bar over the last, and an increase in the blue bar. So all this is going on. What this is at least telling me is today's consumer wants higher quality beef, and they're willing to pay for it. So the next slide kind of bears this out even more graphically. Is the orange bar here represents choice cattle, and the blue bar is prime, and you see just kind of a steady increase. We were in the low 60% in 2010, and now we're approaching 80%, Brad, with those two together. So that's about I might be off a percent or two, but that's roughly a 15% increase just in this decade on quality grading. And I think that's just reflective not only of our domestic demand, but export demand. Export is driving this as far as the quality grade, as well as domestic demand as well. So I think it's just an interesting little tidbit here. How has this occurred? Part of it's genetics. Cattle that have the ability to have superior carcass traits. I think we've learned more about nutrition. We're doing a better job of feeding animals, and healthcare through veterinarians, proper medicines. That's a big topic in the media today about our use of antibiotics. So we're looking at different ways to treat animals and not be quite as dependent on antibiotics. So it'll be interesting to see how this progresses going down the road, but we are seeing a definite increase in quality. So we've talked about a lot of factors to this point. We're going to shift to talk now a little bit about price outlook.
So, as we've seen in those previous slides, we love the taste of beef, myself included, everybody, and we're even, as those slides demonstrated, we're liking even the best of the best beef, what are producers doing to be able to, keep up with the demand and the desires of today's consumer?
Well, they're trying to produce more. I mean, that's obvious. We've seen an increase in numbers. We're trying to produce better beef. Some of the stuff is out of the control on the farm level. It's like trade policies. Like, for example, China. They want to get into that market, but they are very specific on how they want our beef raised and how they want it identified for traceability. Today, we're not meeting a lot of their demands. So until we change some of our production practices, we may not get into a country like China as well. But again, there's a lot of nervous folks now because of the trade wars and discussions over tariffs. I don't know where it's going to go, but we'll say this, that I think it's Extension's responsibility to help farmers do as good a job as they can, educate them on the sound production practices, and we'll see where it goes. But as we wind this up today, we're going to talk a little bit about price outlook, and this is kind of where we've been over the last 5 years. And again, you keep seeing that spike in 2014 and 15. That was kind of a perfect storm as far as economic conditions. And basically, there's three lines here on different categories. Calf prices would be like for feeder calves that were weighing under 600 pounds. Feeders would be more reflective of heavier weight stockers, maybe 750 pound calves. And then fed would be the cattle being fed for harvest. So generally, as animals get heavier in weight, the price per pound comes down. But in 2014 and 15, we saw prices that we may never see again in my lifetime. Fed cattle were averaging over $1.50 a pound. Feeder calves ranging anywhere from $2 to $2.75. I mean, those are just feeder calf prices we haven't seen. And you kind of see as numbers build up, prices tend to moderate, and generally it's stabilized over the last 2 or 3 years, but historically those are fairly competitive price levels. Probably more than ever, though, we're getting some pressure from other species, pork and poultry, because there's so much of that product out there. Okay. Our next slide is reflective of what USDA and Cattle Facts project that our prices will be for the coming year. You see 2018, what they project it'll be for the rest of the year and what they're expecting to happen in 2019. And in general, a reduction in prices. And you can see the range on the far side of where they expect seasonality to happen. I guess something we didn't talk about earlier on prices, there's 2 times a year we do generally see a price spike in beef prices, and it probably would make sense after I say this, is generally or at the beginning of grilling season or Memorial Day, you'll see beef prices edge up because of the popularity as a grilling product, and then towards the end of the year at the holiday season. Those are, if we're going to see a price spike in beef prices, that's typically when we would see those. So those are the projections from USDA and Cattle Facts. Again, you see a general reduction in 2019, but as we move forward, they think this is kind of the peak of expansion. And historically, economists talk about price cycles in the beef industry kind of a 10-year process because the gestation period is so long. You know, we breed a cow today, 283 days gestation length, and generally animals harvested are 15 to 20 months old, so you get an idea how long it takes to change supply, just Mother Nature's limitations. So we don't make reactions as quickly as, say, our other species that we compete against, so we do worry about them. It's just like grain farmers. Grain farmers now worry about how the crops are in South America. They affect soybean and corn prices. So it's become a global market. Today, this is what we wanted to hit on, is some of our economic outlook. As we wrap it up, we're going to go to the other end of the spectrum and show a black cow. And the 2 cows we've shown here are probably the foundation of most of the beef herd in the country, Angus and Hereford cows, but there's dozens of breeds that producers can use, and hopefully they can take some of this information along with production tips that will keep up with what the consumer wants. I think that's the other factor. The consumer is having a larger say in what they want. They want to know more about how we produce food, and they're being more specific on types of production and how they want things raised. So those are some of the changes, Brad, I think we're looking at, and hopefully things will be progressing in a positive manner economically for the beef industry.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. We certainly covered a lot of ground today talking about the various issues that producers are facing. So we thank you again for bringing us all the knowledge today, and we will talk to you next time here on Ag Talk. So for John, I'm Bradford Sherman, and thanks for watching.